What keeps me awake at night? I'm seeing a massive shift in the sort of the economic powers. And the trick in Singapore that has worked very, very well for them was the ability and the courage to choose winners. I have a number of AI agents that work for me. I have, for instance, one that every morning does a literature scan or news scan and an academic literature scan for me. Well, the best way of predicting the future is to create it, absolutely.
Welcome, everyone. This is Gosia Górska, and you're listening to the AI at Scale podcast by Schneider Electric. Today, I have the pleasure welcoming Marek Kowalkiewicz. Hi, Marek.
Thank you for having me.
Marek Kowalkiewicz is a professor and chair in digital economy at Queensland University of Technology in Australia. Recognized as one of 100 global thought leaders in AI, he has led global innovation teams in Silicon Valley, was a founding research manager at SAP's Machine Learning Lab, and a research fellow at Microsoft Research Asia. Marek is the author of the book The Economy of Algorithms, where he explores how algorithmic digital minions are redefining the way we work, also how we create value, and what's the future of business. And this is going to be our topic of the conversation. But before we jump into this, I wanted to ask you a bit about one more title that you listed on your Substack, which is Techno-Possibilist. What does it mean and how it defines you?
Yeah, thanks, Gosia. That's a question that I get quite a lot, and mostly because people tend to ask me, "Hey, Marek, are you an optimist or are you a pessimist when it comes to technologies, when it comes to the impact of artificial intelligence on our world?" And look, I'm neither of those. I'm not an optimist. I'm not a pessimist, because I believe the outcomes of whatever we do with technologies is up to us, and so. I chose to call myself a techno-possibilist to really highlight that mindset. Anything is possible. It is our agency. It is how we shape the world. Of course, it feels like sometimes we don't have enough agency over those large digital corporations, but we still need to have that mindset. We still need to have the push. Thus, I call myself a techno-possibilist.
I like that reply very much. And in your book, The Economy of Algorithms, you describe a new class of digital minions. How do you think the business will change, or already started to change, as we treat algorithms as the new actor in the economy?
Well, first of all, I love this term digital minions, and I came up with it when I listened to a lot of people talking about those digital overlords, how AI systems are going to take over the world. And look, I've done some work in this space, and all those systems that I've seen, they're a bit more like minions, those yellow creatures from the movie, which are very excited, very happy to help us, and they will probably work for us 24/7 if we tell them to do so. But if we look away, all sorts of disasters might happen, and I really wanted to highlight. So that's the digital minions part. Now, when it comes to this new class of actors in the economy, that's a clear reference to the term economic agents that economists use to describe entities that create or consume value in the economy. So in simpler terms, if you hire people, if you sell products, if you buy products, and so on, you're an economic agent. And so in my research, I started to notice that we don't just have two types of agents anymore. We used to talk about humans and organizations as economic agents. We're starting to see algorithms, AI systems, but not even very sophisticated AI systems, just algorithms, hiring people, selling products, buying products, so doing what economic agents would be doing. So that's my perspective here. Importantly, and that's also one other reason why I'm talking about digital minions now, is we need to understand that these are not synthetic humans or artificial humans. They behave very differently. And so this metaphor of minions is also a highlight to make us all understand that they're a bit different than us.
I see. That's a nice metaphor. And how would you evaluate the value of these digital minions? So, what's the real value of AI in the economy? And the source of this question is because so many organizations are still struggling to calculate return on investment from AI initiatives. Why is it so difficult?
Well, look, first of all, I guess if I knew the exact answer to this question, I probably wouldn't be here. I'd be making a lot of money just selling that advice to everyone, simply because everyone's trying to understand how to properly measure the return on investment when it comes to AI investment. All that I can say is that we're starting to have some sense of what that value is. But at the same time, it's not that clear. Why is it hard to measure ROI? It's because there's so many things that are changing at the same time. We use AI to shorten the time it takes to perform a task. But the actual output of the task is also changing now. And not just that, it could be the quality that changes. There's rework that's being generated. Sometimes when we use AI, it actually generates work in other areas. So being able to measure all those impacts themselves, and this is even before we talk about changes to the entire system, is really, really hard.
It's hard to separate the influence of AI from other factors that are also important. And from your observations, what is becoming cheaper and what is becoming more expensive?
I have a number of AI agents that work for me. I have, for instance, one that every morning does a literature scan or news scan and an academic literature scan for me. It does prepare an analysis for me. This happens every morning. The agent performs this analysis based on its knowledge of my previous writing, of my research. The agent then compiles it into about 1,000 words piece that is then translated into an audio file. It's a bit like a podcast that's being sent to my text message or to my phone via text message, and then I can listen to it while I'm driving to work. Now, in the past, the work that's being done, this would probably cost me, I don't know, $100, $200 to perform the sort of the level of analysis that is being done every day for me. Now I pay about $5 or $6 for that in the API costs for using that. So it's definitely becoming cheaper to perform those mundane tasks. I wouldn't say repetitive because they're quite complex, but definitely mundane. So that's becoming cheaper. What's becoming more expensive is the sort of further stages in this kind of information chain. So what I described to you is a creation of an information artifact. And for me, when I'm listening to it while I'm driving, the sort of 100% accuracy is not required. It's okay if those bots hallucinate a tiny bit, because all that I need is some sort of inspiration so that I have something to think about and then research during the day. However, if I wanted to ensure that this is 100% correct, this would take a lot of work. The type of mistakes that those AI agents make, the type of hallucinations that they make, is very, very hard to predict. And so humans, if correcting that, have to spend way more time than the time it would take them or take us to correct documents that are created by other humans. So there you go, right? Mm-hmm. Creation, the sort of early creation gets cheaper, but the later stages might get more expensive.
Especially the more accuracy you want, the more expensive it gets. Right.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And look, there's a number of organizations that learned it the hard way, including being penalized, including losing contracts because, they would deliver reports with some hallucinated references or, parts that are absolutely incorrect. We keep hearing those stories. Why do we keep hearing those stories? Because that act of checking, that's a costly exercise. And a lot of organizations, a lot of individuals decide to skip that cost and risk risk it, right? And unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, that's a good lesson for all of us. But unfortunately, those people then pay the penalty for it.
Mm-hmm. So there is some value that is being unlocked, and we can even mention some kind of democratization of these tools that usually wouldn't be accessible to everyone, and now they are. That's great. Let's look at the other side of the coin. So where actually the value drops. You are writing a lot about slop-fluencers and the fact that instead of delivering value to human, we are now creating maybe a content that is actually catering to the interests of algorithms. So in the end, the quality and the value of it is dropping. Can you give us some examples and can you tell us a bit more about this?
Well, look, I mean, this is what we all see on social media, right? Social media platforms, of course, use algorithms to identify content that might be interesting, that might bring some additional engagement when it comes to the users of social media. And on the other side, there's social media contributors who use algorithms to create that content that fits what those social media algorithms prefer. So we have this sort of double-edged situation where algorithms are used to create content that is then judged by other algorithms. Where are humans in this equation? Where do we fit? Where do we, those who would like to read that content, fit? And you've seen that a lot, those sort of generic content on social media. That's why I started to talk about slop-fluencers. That's a sort of a combination of the word influencer and AI slop. A slop-fluencer is somebody who doesn't really write their own thoughts, but just gets algorithms to create those. This is like a generic, maybe a non-business example, but obviously that cost translates into business situations as well. We have managers, executives who might be asking chatbots or Gen AI systems for business advice. This does not have to be a problem as long as you use those systems to expand your thinking, to contribute to your thinking. That's fine. But if you use those systems to literally make decisions for you, this is where you unintentionally start following the directions of an algorithm. Maybe it's intentional, actually. There has to be some intent when you do that. But you start to follow the algorithm. And look, I mean, if you're a terrible manager or entrepreneur, maybe the algorithm is better than you. But in many cases, I think that's actually not very smart to be following those algorithms without any reflection. And so we start seeing those unintended consequences as well.
And we need some kind of a filter, right, to be sure that we should follow actually the advice, which brings us also to the next question about innovation. I was quite surprised to learn that you have traveled a lot and you lived on many continents. So you did your PhD in Poland. You've worked across Silicon Valley, Singapore, Australia, and each of them has a very different innovation culture. What's the most successful approach in terms of experimentation, failure, or scaling? What has surprised you?
So first of all those places where I lived in have very different approaches, right? So, Europe tends to be very structured and very protective in a good sense when it comes to innovation, right? The first thing that people think about is this going in the right direction and so on. This is good, but from my perspective, often that means that innovation is slower. It's not worse, but it's slower. Then we have the approach in the US, where I would refer to it as permissionless innovation. Everyone comes up with ideas. Let's test it. Let's think about consequences later. Look, the speed is massive. The growth of companies is massive. But yes, we occasionally have disasters, and that concerns me a lot. And then we have places like Singapore, where I lived. I also spent a bit of my life in China. And so those countries have a slightly different approach. Well, China is very strict on regulation, which is not very, very different from what happens in Europe. But at the same time, there's a lot of pressure on, or push on coming up with new ideas. But what I liked a lot was actually what happens in Singapore. It's a very tiny country, but it really punches above its weight. It's a really, really strong economy, a really, really strong contributor to AI and technology, especially when you consider how small it is. And the trick in Singapore that has worked very, very well for them was the ability and the courage to choose winners. The government in Singapore would say, well, for the next 5 or 10 years, we're going to invest heavily in data centers, but we're also going to invest heavily in capabilities of our citizens in data science, data processing, and so on. So this would be a holistic approach. And look, it sounds a bit like this, 5-year plan, 10-year plan, but it's working for them. And so I would say, at least from my perspective, and look, we of course need to look into the data, but what we're seeing in Singapore, they're doing pretty well. That ability and courage to choose winners is something that I wish more countries were doing.
Mm-hmm. So they are making definitely some bold bets, and then they follow, they finance, they invest. It takes us to the next question, which is about new value streams. What keeps you awake at night, and what ancient Egypt has to do with it?
So you mentioned early on that I wrote that book called The Economy of Algorithms. And in that book, I think it was chapter 1 or chapter 2, when I was talking about the different mindsets, I talked about this case in ancient Egypt where I imagined a visionary scribe. I thought that would be the words that they would use in Egypt for a futurist. So an ancient visionary scribe imagining the future, and the ancient visionary scribe would imagine the future in which we would have automated spear throwers and maybe an oracle in every home, and perhaps we would have machines that would carve out hieroglyphs automatically. But my point there was that everything that this visionary scribe would come up with was just an extension of the current reality. And I think we often make exactly this mistake. We look at AI agents and we ask ourselves, well, now, humans do procurement. Well, AI agents will do automated procurement. This is exactly the same as that visionary scribe talking about automated spear throwers, right? It kind of feels futuristic, but once you realize that, in the hindsight, it'll be very narrow-minded, that's exactly what's happening right now. So what keeps me awake at night? I'm seeing a massive shift in the sort of the economic powers. The internet has shifted or decentralized information. Right, so we used to have centralized information in a number of places. The internet has made it freely accessible, but also distributed in a very uniform way. I think what we're seeing at the moment is decentralization of intelligence. And when I mean intelligence, I probably should call it expertise. So we have those large players in the economy who have centralized expertise. This could be large engineering firms, large legal firms, and so on and so on. I think what we'll start to see very, very soon is that expertise becomes decentralized, becomes available to much smaller players. And just like with internet about 20 or 30 years ago, we will start to see that sort of even distribution of it. To give you a very specific example, right now with my team, and I have a very, very small team, we are able to build software for some of our commercial research projects, a software of quality that was absolutely unachievable for us in the past. And in fact, in some cases, we're faster and better than professional software vendors. Why is that? That's because we never actually created that legacy of an organization that builds software. We didn't used to build software, but we do have the software engineering skills. So we don't have to be as slow as traditional vendors. It's a bit like what happened in Eastern Europe in the early 90s, where new banks could immediately jump into the online banking and all those new technologies simply because they didn't have the legacy. And that's what happens for the teams like mine. We're very, very small, but this new world enables us to be very agile and very, very powerful, which is super exciting.
And it leaves some place for smaller players to participate in the economy and maybe cause some disruption for bigger companies. So my last question is about some advice that you can give to our listeners about preparing to the future. And I was thinking about the angle of strategic thinking, because AI and also other technologies, they often change the rules mid-game. As you mentioned, the next disruption can come from a very small player, maybe from a startup. So how we should change the strategic thinking to prepare for this kind of future and secure our businesses from this kind of disruptions?
I think the first, my first reaction to your question is that AI and those new systems are not only changing rules mid-game, but they're actually changing the game completely, which is really something that we don't fully understand yet. But what I mean by that is that some organizations might believe that they're in a specific industry, but the whole system might change. The whole ecosystem, the industries might turn into arenas, and so we're not sure really how this world develops. How do you think about a world that keeps changing like that? It's very, very hard. I guess and you're asking me for very, very specific advice. So I'll say the following, and it's based on what we've already discussed. If you're a large organization, perhaps right now you're thinking, I will be disrupted by another large organization or a startup that becomes a large organization. That's a valid thinking, but at the same time, it's a bit of a thinking in hieroglyphs, because you're not considering that the world might look very, very different in future. So the challenge that I would give to everyone who's listening to this conversation right now is to think that perhaps your next competitor is millions of competitors, is tiny organizations, maybe tiny artificial intelligence agents that figure out how to coordinate their activities, how to work together. And in the same way that insects form swarm intelligence, and where an individual insect cannot do much, but the entire swarm is actually quite capable, we might start to see this in the economy as well. Will it happen? Well, look, I'm not a futurist. I cannot really predict the future, but I think this is a potential future that we should consider and ask ourselves how to prepare for it. You did ask me this question: how does an organization sort of prepare and maybe defend? Honestly, I don't know. This maybe from my perspective, it's better if those millions of players win, because maybe that leads to a new economy. But I think one approach would be to really try to understand how this change might look and become part of that change rather than resisting the change. Become part of it.
Yes, or maybe you don't have to wait for the future to come. You should create it proactively with the tools that we have now at our hands, right?
Well, the best way of predicting the future is to create it. Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Marek. It was a very insightful conversation.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you all for listening and watching. You can discover next episodes on your favorite podcast platform or on YouTube. See you.